This gentleman here, Keith Hollingworth, was a sculptor that Chuck Close befriended when he was teaching art at University of Massachusetts Amherst. And interestingly, Keith was the first subject of Chuck Close's first print project. In 1972, Catherine Brown, who's the director of Crown Point Press, invited Chuck Close to create an edition work. At that time, he wasn't that interested in it. He didn't think that printmaking held that much for him because he was focusing very much on his large-scale portraits that, quite frankly, had been very well received in the art world. I will have to say that in the original group of the original group of 7 large black and white airbrushed portraits, which is really what put him on the map, the first one he ever sold was the large-scale self-portrait where he has a cigarette hanging out of his mouth. And, you know, he's kind of looking, you know, really cool, kind of menacing, actually looking down a little bit. The Walker Art Center actually owns that. And Martin Friedman, who is the former director of the Walker, who really brought such great vision to that program and to the Twin Cities, purchased that painting from the exhibition for the Walker's collection. And Chuck Close famously says that then he asked, the purchase price was $3,000, but then he had the nerve to pay for it over time. So anyway, one can only wonder what the value of such a thing is now. But Keith was a subject of one of those original 7 paintings. And so for his first print at Crown Point Press, he basically went in with the attitude, okay, what's the most impossible thing that we can do? And the process of mezzotint pretty much came up in the discussion that it is one of the most difficult and time-consuming processes there is in printmaking. And just to give you an abbreviated version, and please, if there are printmakers here who are far more knowledgeable than me who wants to jump in, please do. But just quickly, how mezzotints are created is that you begin with a copper plate, smoothly polished and finished, and with a series of rockers that are have gradations of little burrs on them. You go over and you create a consistent texture on the copper plate, and then very meticulously and carefully a tool is used, a metal tool is used to go in and smooth down those textures in order to create the image. Now oftentimes when you see mezzotints, they're about the size of a credit card or maybe a little bit bigger because they're so remarkably time consuming. But the soft glow of that process is, there's no comparison to it. So what he proposed was we're going to do the biggest one that's ever been attempted. So the Keith mezzotint was the first piece that he actually pursued. Turns out he was out there for months and months and months working on this piece, and working on it very much in his usual process of grid, and then working with the tool and getting the copper plate just right. There was only an addition of 10. And during the process, where he actually began in the middle of the picture plane, like right around in here, right around in his nose and mouth area, they ran so many proofs, right? They ran so many proofs that it began to wear down the copper. So when you see a reproduction of Keith mezzotint, or you see a real one in person, you'll see that the area right around here in this spot on the face is very light. It's faded almost. And that's because they ran so many proofs that that wore the plate down, and it looks somewhat inconsistent. But what it gives us is evidence of the process, evidence of the time it took to actually figure it out. So someone along the way said, well, we just need to pick it up and get moving. So he went ahead and finished it out. Again, there's only 10 of those in existence, and I think this fall one is coming up for auction, which is a very rare occurrence. So back to Keith. So Keith was very much an instrumental figure, pun intended, in his development of his print works. So here you have lithographed 4 times, experimenting with different sizes and applications of the lithographic crayon on the stone. And then you'll see this kind of comparison, this side-by-side comparison, this juxtaposition throughout the exhibition. And I think it speaks very much about his inability to leave well enough alone. To always figure out a way, and I cannot totally identify this because, you know, I always, okay, I'm going to bring up his golfing analogy. And I'll be very brief. But he talks about his process of whether it's making paintings or working on prints as very much like a game of golf, where you start off with one big gesture, right, a big drive. And then it's a series of more and more refined movements that get you to your objective, which is getting the ball in the hole, right? So in his work, he envisions this one big start. Okay, we're going to get this image from photograph to, in this case, paper pulp. But then he invariably tees off in the wrong direction. So there's always this grand circling back to get to whatever the objective might be, but invariably winding up in unexpected and wonderful places. So whereas you have Keith paper pulp here in gray, and I will say that there's a version of this, I think, in black and also in white, the background. Here, during the course of creating these, and again, this speaks to the fact that he's there as oftentimes as these things are being made, he said, well, what if we, you know, while it's mushy, you know, kind of like mashed potatoes, what if I take my hand and get in there and mess around with it? And so when you see the term manipulated beside the titles of these works, that oftentimes is an indicator that he's getting in there and he's mushing that around, so to speak, just like you would if you were to go back in with hand coloring on a print and create kind of a unique experience out of that. And what's happening here is, again, that blurring of the very rigid grid structure. So again, you have this image, which again, if you were to get across the back of the room, it would start to read as a very tight black and white image. But here, the same kind of thing. You have this pixelization here that's very defined and very regimented. So that's the great thing about having a resource as significant as this one, whereas you can start playing around with those juxtapositions and really begin to extrapolate a story about not only about his process, but also about just his philosophy that's always been in place, is just to keep pushing it. Yeah.